Our next presenter is Phil Riden from the University of Nottingham, who's going to be talking about Waterways history and community history, reconciling the irreconcilable. Okay, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry that I'm starting rather later than advertised. You should in fact be getting the next speaker at 12:20, not me. I will try and keep my remarks as brief as possible so that the other member of the audience who is speaking after me before lunch has a reasonable crack of the whip. What I want to talk about briefly is the outcome of a Connect Communities project which we had in the History Department, Nottingham, a couple of years ago, which was concerned with the fairly recent history of trade and traffic on the River Trent and associated canals. This was to some extent a complement of an individual research project I'd had myself on the earlier history of traffic on the Trent. Because it was a Connect Communities project, it was intended to be run with associated voluntary organisations. And we initially brigaded two into that fold. One was the Newark Heritage Barge Project, which is a group of enthusiasts in and around Newark who are renovating a traditional Upper Trent barge, which is intended to become a floating heritage centre for the river. This is a unique project in terms of conservation of waterways heritage in Britain. There is no other museum-type project that is actually based on board a boat, which seems to me to have considerable merit. And also, it's the only project of its sort connected with the Trent. So that was a fairly obvious community partner. The other one was perhaps less obvious, but it seemed to me a good idea at the time. This was the body known as the Railway and Canal Historical Society, a national organisation founded in the early 1950s, intended to bring together people, mainly, it must be said, interested in railway history, but at the instance of one of its founding fathers, the society also included waterways history in its scope, and in practice has widened out since then to include road transport and some other branches of transport history. The partnership with the Newark Heritage Barge Project worked well. We held a number of quite successful workshops and seminar meetings actually on board the barge. The profit which the Heritage Barge Group made from those ventures was happily sufficient to install central heating in the barge, which made the events more comfortable. We've gone on since then to collaborate with the NHB people in other work. We failed in an initial application to the AHRC for follow-on funding to digitise our findings, or they were hoping to resubmit a more modest proposal. We did, on the other hand, get funding for a day school last summer, which I thought went well, held again in Newark. We're hoping to get similar funding for another event of that sort this year. What worked rather less successfully was the attempt to involve the RCHS, the Railway and Canal Historical Society. In practice, the link with the RCHS was largely personal. As it happened, a former member of the University of Nottingham, the author of a very good Nottingham PhD thesis on canal history, happened to be president of the RCHS at the time this project was running. She also lives in the East Midlands. Dr. Freer was personally very supportive of what we did and played an important part in the project. The RCHS, as a corporate body, played absolutely no part at all. One or two of their members came to the initial meeting. We held the initial set of public lectures. Thereafter, there was no interest, despite the fact, if you look at the RCHS's own publicity, they will say that they have a long-standing and active East Midlands group within the society. It didn't work for whatever reason. And this prompts me to think of where we go next, because as I say, we are planning a further application to the AHRC for a project mainly intended to digitise, to make more widely available our findings from the more narrowly researched project. Do I attempt also, again, to involve the RCHS, or do I not bother? Is it in fact possible within the framework of the Connect Communities programme, particularly the heritage side of it, to involve not just, say, local history societies, local arts groups, local whatever kind of groups, that is to say, groups essentially focused in one place, which I think is probably what the HRC has in mind? Or is it possible to involve voluntary national organisations who, again, are essentially amateur groups, if you like, say, the typical amateur local history society, a local arts group or whatever? Is it practicable to involve national organisations as well? Are they a community that can be involved? This has come back to the forefront of my mind to some extent as a result of the appearance in the Journal of the Railway Canal Historical Society of a kind of whither waterways history, where do we go next kind of article. Now, I happen to be personally somewhat cynical about this kind of article because I find that whatever activity the author is writing about, it will usually carry on quite happily without his or less commonly her intervention. I also work in the field of local history, and around the turn of the century, a number of public lectures were organised on the lines of local history in the new millennium, local history the way forward. And although I will admit to having given one of those lectures myself, I did preface my remarks on that occasion by saying that local history had operated quite well for at least the second half of the previous millennium, and I was quite confident it would continue quite happily into the next half millennium without any intervention on my part or anybody else's. I'm prepared to say that, given the average age of the members of a lot of local history societies, I should perhaps revise that judgment, but even so, I am generally cynical about these articles which tell other people how to do what they're doing. Anyway, this article had, as one tends to put at the end of these articles, an invitation saying, I hope this will provoke a lively debate within the Railway Canal Historical Society. Foolishly, not being over-occupied in the summer vacation last summer, I decided to write an article that would perhaps take this debate forward. This produced an interesting response. First of all, it produced a vitriolic, not to say personally abusive, email from the author of the original article and a peremptory demand to the editor of the journal that he be allowed to reply. I ignored the email and the editor of the journal refused to allow further contribution by the original writer to the debate. At the same time, I insisted my article be refereed, and I should say the RCHS journal is what I would call a crossover journal. Not all its contributions are refereed, and I suggested a referee be found from within the ranks of the RCHS, because to some extent I'd reviewed their history since the 1950s, and also a second referee from the university sector. One of the suggestions I made towards the end of my article, because I said I didn't want to be entirely negative about the amateur part, the amateur role in transport history, I said that a possible way forward for the Railway Canal Historical Society to make a bigger contribution to the study of waterways history than it had done in recent years was to take part in a collaborative revision of the standard series of regional histories of the waterways of the British Isles, a series associated with and largely written by the late Charles Hadfield, who was one of the founders of the RCHS. I was struck by the fact that the RCHS referee of my article took no notice of that point at all, even though it occupies the last 2 or 3 pages of my article. The university referee, whose identity I don't know and I can't actually guess at, the university referee picked on it and said it was an excellent idea, and that any university picking up and running with this idea would have an ideal impact case study for the 2020 ref, because it would be an involvement of the university with a voluntary organisation. My view is that we now have to leave it until my article appears, I think, in the March issue of the RCHS journal, and see what kind of response there is either from RCHS members interested in canal history and or any university historians interested in this aspect of transport history. But I make this point to raise the general question of whether Connect Communities' work will tend always to be an association of a university in a particular region, perhaps 2 or 3 universities in the same or different regions, and voluntary organisations which are essentially local in character, in outlook, what have you. And there have obviously been a number of Connect Communities projects that have been run on those lines, which we'll be hearing about others later today, or whether it is actually possible to look at collaboration with voluntary organisations whose own remit is national, and who could be brought in to one particular university or 2 or 3 universities and encouraged to collaborate. Transport history is one of those branches of historical scholarship where there has traditionally been a large amateur input, in my view for good rather than for bad. It is true there's been something of a parting of the ways in recent years if you compare the Journal of the Railway and Canal Historical Society with the Journal of Transport History, the main, indeed the only specialist journal in this field. Then if you look at, say, the 1950s and 60s, the 2 journals were publishing similar material. Okay, one perhaps went into the subject more fully than the other. Since then, there has been a movement away. There's been a pulling away. And one former editor of the Journal of Transport History did say once, I thought somewhat gratuitously in the journal, that amongst transport historians of waterways had had particular difficulty escaping the trap of local history. He didn't actually explain why local history was a trap. But anyway, my own view is that in both local history and transport history, there is a considerable role for what can, I think, legitimately be called the amateur enthusiast. Charles Hadfield himself, as principal writer for many years in this field, was an independent scholar, as he would now be called. He was a man of independent means. He simply wrote for a living. He wrote very good middle ground economic history. So my own feeling is that we should try and involve in perhaps future Connected Communities projects as many different voluntary organisations as we can. Many of these, I think, will be locally based for whatever reason, whatever field they're in, but at the same time, it is worth trying. In the case of the RCHS, I would not underestimate the struggle involved. It is worth trying to involve some national organisations and perhaps to try and give them a new focus, a new remit. I'd be interested in discussion to hear what any colleagues have to say in areas other than the rather esoteric field of waterways history.
Before you depart, can you tell me what was so contentious about your original article?
Well, even the academic referee did use the phrase unnecessarily ad hominem.
Right.
Now, it's okay. I have a well-earned reputation for making comments and footnotes that people sometimes like to check with their libel lawyers. But, and yes, I did say things like rather long-winded as a preface to a citation, or what else can I say? Worse than the series, I think was another phrase which was removed on reconsideration. But, sorry, was that...
So was it matters of tone then?
Yes, it usually is the thing I write, yes. No, that's all it was. No, apart from one paragraph where I apparently misunderstood what the original author said, or I dispute, which I removed completely.
Okay.
The content survived really more or less unchanged, as I was encouraged to alter bits of the text and rather more of the footnotes. But I still was reading the line, just goes to things. It's meant to be a debating piece. It's not presenting historical research, it's a rejoinder to an article that said the author said he'd like responses when he got one. I got a very lengthy array of abuse from him. I just said, dear son, I'm sorry you're so upset. Yours ever. And it didn't seem really worth getting.
Okay, all right, thank you.